A bit slow. Okay, so what we are talking about is something like some idea that appeared like many years ago, 2002, related to say that internet is not just a business, but it's something that is for everyone, and it's a new type of communication space, and therefore it's related to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It has to do with freedom of expression, and then that means that, well, we have to make sure that everyone has access. Not everyone might need it or may have access to it because languages, because of relevant content and everything. But also, let's not forget that unlike the air, it's also like an infrastructure, and therefore participation also involves like the provision. Provision it can be a way of life, can be an economic activity, and it contributes to development. So in the definition of universal service, we talk about functional internet connection. We talk about affordability because it's not free, like the air or sometimes water. And when we talk about full engagement is just like the difference perhaps between being a citizen or being a consumer. So we are allowed to have access, but probably we should be allowed to do something more. When it comes to rural areas somehow are defined by the opposition of what is a urban area. So it's a place where the population density is low, and it's a place where typical infrastructures, they are not yet there. So it's really difficult to see how we can sustain connectivity and network services in places that are defined by the lack of infrastructures. If you look at numbers or statistics, for instance, this come from ITU. This year they talk about like what is the distribution of offline population. Let's focus on Europe. 131 million people, according to ITU, are not connected, are offline, let's say. And if you look at the distribution of offline population, there are biases. You see there are different groups in terms of income, age, gender, education, and particularly 60% of them live in rural areas. So why? Well, there are many factors. Basically because the internet started as a pure business, as a private business, as a luxury, and then that luxury is not, seems to be reaching certain areas. Well, the challenge is finding ways to connect more than 50% of the global population. I mean, provide them the chance to be part of this global communication space. And there are models which some people call it in a kind of radical manner like extractive, because there are investors from outside that come to the communities. They feed them in exchange of a fee, and the fee goes back to the investors and leaves the community. So in that way, they're extracting value from the community in exchange of service, but then this money is hard to, it will come back. Or another way is like with food. We can be forced to go to very well-crafted restaurants, but typically we cannot afford to have to eat every day in a restaurant, and we need to be allowed to cook at home. So while cooking at home, self-provisioning connectivity should be possible, which sometimes doesn't look like that, especially because it will never, in a way, it will be profitable for a business to invest in a farm, in connectivity for people living in the fields, when there are still some customers in urban areas that are willing to pay a lot for a premium service. So there was already a definition of what a community network is. I'm not going to repeat it, but you know, it's when we talk about 5G and all these wonders of the technology, let's not forget that we also need commodity devices, cheap devices that allow everyone to build like connectivity. It doesn't have to be that fast, especially if you have nothing. And these technologies allow you to spontaneously create networks and to create what we call it commons. resources which are critical for the sustainability of certain communities. If you don't have internet access, sometimes you cannot live in the countryside, you cannot do business in the countryside, you cannot access to knowledge. So these commons, this infrastructure that cannot be provided by one, but can be built by the contribution of several, that is a commons, and the commons can be governed through the principles of Nobel Prize Elinor Ostrom, which says that there is an idea of common property or common pool resource, which is a successful model for thousands of years, proven in many fields. And basically, of course, this type of cooperative endeavors, they ensure access, participation, and also provision, create generation of economic activity in areas where there are not, instead of extractive models, let's say. And just one, I took a quick look at the documentation about the wireless for EU, and just a few comments. I mean, I think it's a very good idea, but let's see how it develops. Because one thing is what is put in the paper, the other thing is the effect of the participation of the different players in this supposed to be market, but very asymmetric one. So I'm always puzzled by the words that we use to refer to speed. Like we sometimes when people say ultra fast, mega, whatever, we never know what it is. It's redefined every time. Let's just say, well, I mean, we are not trying to work at time out of speed, at the slowest speed that the connection works, minimally works, because I mean it works, but it's not usable. But let's think about like line speed, whatever the technology can provide. I mean, that's the kind of thing. It's like water. It's just, not just a few drops of water, but like all the water that comes from the pipe, in a way. I wonder, there's a mention about connectivity in centers of public life, but rural areas have a few centers, but people is spread across the territory. I wonder how this is going to be usable. I mean, when GIFINET, for instance, started, you needed to get to the internet, to everywhere, you need to travel 60, 70 kilometers. If you need to travel 10 kilometers to get to the internet, maybe some people will not be able to do it. It's interesting and funny in a way. This mentioned that these deployments where telecom operators have expressed no interest. Let's see how no interest is defined, because sometimes the interest is defined by competitive interest that appears only when a local initiative appears. So they block it and then they connect half of the population. And there are many examples of that. So that's called overbuilding. And you see it everywhere in Europe and everywhere in the world. I understand the document has a limited space, but there are words which it doesn't show in them, which I think they would bring some fairness into the game. Well, there is a reference to monitoring and evaluation that it says is not yet defined. So depending on how it is defined, only big telecom players will be able to pretend to provide that kind of service. And no communities will be able to really, small players, small kitchens cannot compete with large restaurants. So let's see how it develops, because it's very important. And there are many examples of community networks that are providing, let's say, better service than telecom providers in places where, particularly everywhere, I mean, in high margin places, but also in negative margin places. One good example is a global space. Barn is a very good initiative in Lancashire in the UK that is providing probably the best connectivity in the UK by far. They offer gigabit connectivity, purely gigabit, nothing less. In Mexico, there is even like a GSM provider which they use land and spectrum rights for communities to provide GSM connectivity that is not, from a spectrum that is not used by the telecom providers. We have GIFINET with this model that Ramon can explain more, fiber from the farm, not fiber to the home, but from and the farm. And many other initiatives all over Europe. So it's a proven model, and it's a proven model that is, let's say, in the worst case, is complementary to the other models. So if we want to provide connectivity to everyone, we need to have diversity of models. Otherwise, yeah, there is a queue, and rural areas are in the last positions of the queue. So just summarizing, very important, especially in rural areas, to talk about the ability to self-provide. If we cannot cook at home, restaurants will never cover our needs. There is a market, but the market is, I mean, there's a huge elephants and mice. You cannot expect it to self-regulate. You need to, and especially, I mean, there are lobbies which unfortunately they have a big influence in the policy making. I mean, you know them all probably. I mean, and be careful, because like this for rural areas, this is can be a missed opportunity. I mean, we can connect them, we can feed them with access, we can extract value from them. But then probably, I mean, that is the difference between a citizen and a consumer. If you can consume, you can pay, but if you do not have the chance to provide and make sure that the money doesn't leave the community, it doesn't create a local loop and it goes back to the central companies, yeah, then we are not living in a democracy, we're living in a farm. And yeah, I think we don't want to look like that, or be ruled by the guy who lives over there. So yeah, that's a rural image. Thank you very much.